We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined this week by the Scottish Daily Express editor Ben Borland and the Sunday Mail editor John Ferguson. So we're recording on Wednesday, and today is Gers Day in Scottish politics. That's not a reference to Rangers or Derek McInnes, but to the annual Scottish Government publication that sets out all revenues raised in Scotland and all public spending by and on behalf of Scotland. Sounds really tedious and dry, and it mostly is, but it is a hot political issue because the top line in the Gers document is always the total deficit faced by Scotland, and this year that is £25.3 billion. And what usually happens is that the pro-UK parties say that this shows the benefits of the union and the risk of independence, while the pro-Indy parties say that it's pretty much an indictment of Scotland's place in the union. So start with you, John. This is a Scottish Government publication. Now, given that it always produces a bad headline for the Scottish Government, are you surprised that they continue to publish it?
I mean, I guess if they stopped publishing it, then that would become the story, given that, every year it shows that, surprise, surprise, Scotland's spending vast sums more than it's contributing in tax revenue. I mean, overall, the picture is that, in actual fact, the deficit has reduced from last year. That's the good news. The bad news is that it's still absolutely enormous. I mean, the context to this that I think is sometimes missing is that overall across the UK, there is also an enormous deficit. That just in general, governments tend to spend a lot more money than they raise because that's, in a democracy, people always enjoy getting stuff that they haven't paid for. The more difficult calculation, I guess, to really understand would be how much extra is being spent in Scotland that they just wouldn't have if they had the same levels of debt as an independent country. And I think these calculations sometimes get so difficult to work out that you're as well not trying. But so the picture is always that the nationalist politicians will find a way to present this as evidence that Scotland would be better off as an independent country, while unionist parties will say this is evidence that Scotland can't stand on its own 2 feet and is benefiting greatly from pooling and sharing of resources.
I mean, John, is it simple to say that this shows that on the first day of independence there would be a £25 billion deficit, or is it more complicated than that, do you think?
I mean, I think that if I understand it correctly, it is true. But the fact is that in the UK today, we are also hundreds of billions in deficit. And so what you would have would be a heavily indebted Scotland rather than a heavily in debt UK. The question is whether an independent Scotland would end up with vastly increased interest payments, and whether when all of these things balanced out, Scotland would be faced with a situation where they had to make huge public spending cuts. That's the part of it that I think is more difficult to really work out.
Ben, clearly from a unionist perspective, this shows that Scotland needs the rest of the UK. But look at it from a conservative centre-right perspective. Do you have any concerns that Scotland is in deficit to such a degree? Wouldn't it be better if, even within the United Kingdom, that deficit was as close to zero as possible?
Well, it would certainly be better if it was as close to the level in the rest of the UK. John's right. The whole of the UK, most countries run a deficit. The key figure there is what percentage of your GDP is it, and Scotland's is always very, very high, and I think the highest in Europe. So, I mean, that's the concern. It's not that there is a deficit, it's that the deficit is such a huge amount of the actual gross domestic product of Scotland. So yeah, ideally you want to get it down. You want to get it down as soon as possible. It's not just from a centre-right conservative perspective. I think from any perspective, you would want to get this deficit down. Certainly, if I was a Scottish nationalist and hoped one day that Scotland would be independent, one of the big things I would be worried about would be you'll never get back into the EU with a deficit to GDP percentage like this one. So it's almost more important for nationalists to get this down. I think that the history of Gers is really interesting. You go back to the 2000s and the sort of early years of the 2010s, and the sort of the second great golden age of North Sea oil, and Gers was a really rosy document. Alex Salmond basically used it as the building blocks for his argument for independence. Scotland would be a wealthy country. Look at Gers. And back then, everyone went. It was the other side. It was the unionist side who's saying, "Oh, these figures are rubbish," and then suddenly it's flipped. And in the past decade or so, it's the nationalists who say, "Oh, these figures aren't worth the paper they're written on." And it's interesting. I'm sure you remember that over the years they've moved the publication date. It used to be, I think, later in the year. It's now been pushed into slap bang in the middle of the Holyrood summer recess. Everyone's away on holiday, and you get these terrible figures come out in the middle of August when no one's really thinking about politics. And then today they actually launched them. I saw Jenny Gilruth launch the figures up in Dundee. So you've got she's gone to a city where there's no TV station. There's only one newspaper based there. We're all down in the central belt, and it looks like basically lots of media outlets didn't even bother going to cover it. So the Scottish government's ongoing attempts to bury these figures are proving quite successful.
I think it's been, this used to be a big deal, particularly in the referendum year, Gers Day and the deficit figure. 2026 doesn't seem to have the same importance, does it? I mean, it's come and gone, and now the circus has moved on.
Well, it's hypothetical. That there isn't going to be a referendum. There's certainly not going to be one this Parliament because John Swinney has failed to meet his own mandate for one. So there's not even an argument for one in the next 5 years. So these figures are entirely hypothetical. There's no referendum. There's not one in the horizon. I mean, you might as well pause Gers till 2032 and come back because, yeah, it's a hypothetical thing, but it is also completely and overwhelmingly proof positive that if Scotland were to be independent, we would either need massive spending cuts or massive tax rises. It's just irrefutable.
John, when I read publications like this and I see the level of the deficit, I understand the SNP argument for independence. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I understand it, which is, well, if an independent parliament had the full levers of independence, then they can make decisions to grow the economy, get that deficit down and whatnot. But I think that when I see there's a £25 billion deficit, it does make a mockery of the argument for fiscal autonomy inside the United Kingdom. So the Parliament would have one hand tied behind its back in terms of its levers, yet be forced to raise all the money it wanted to spend, which would inevitably lead to unprecedented spending cuts.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The one way of looking at this is that bad Gers figures are proof that the union isn't working, that we're performing terribly economically, and we're running up huge debts, and that, Scotland would be better taking control of these things itself. But yes, if we were to do that, we would be in huge debt. The question is, would we be in any more debt relatively that we're in already and dealing with as an economy already, albeit through the Treasury and the Bank of England? So I can remember back to 2014, the referendum years, where actually the discussion was around, well, how would we divide up the debt if Scotland became independent? And this was a sort of big issue, like, it would essentially be a kind of divorce settlement where Scotland would be agreeing to take a certain percentage of overall UK debt as part of a negotiation on what UK assets, including the use of the pound that Scotland would be retaining. So I think it's when you get into it in that level that it just becomes very difficult, really, given that independence doesn't look anywhere close at the moment. It's just such a hypothetical discussion to actually try to drill down into what position economically would an independent Scotland be in, other than to say it would kind of be in the same position it's in now. It would be a heavily indebted Northern European country that spends a lot more on healthcare and social services, etc., than it could really afford to.
Can I there is one thing about Gers that I've seen, and I'm sure viewers will have seen on social media, all sorts of wild claims about how there's sort of secret export figures that aren't being applied to Gers, and any whiskey that goes out through an English port doesn't get applied to Gers. There's all kinds of crackpot conspiracy theories about this, and it would be really helpful if a Scottish government minister would just put these to bed and say, look, we produce these figures. These are our figures. There's nothing hidden. There isn't billions and billions of pounds of Scottish exports that aren't included, because they never seem to address these conspiracy theories. And it would be nice just for once to have someone sober, someone sensible like John Swinney just say, look, can we stop this? These are our figures. They're accurate. They're as accurate as you can get. Can we have no more talk of how there's, they're being manipulated?
And, given that it's a Scottish government publication, it would be pretty nonsensical to do that. I thought it was interesting, just a quote from the document. It said the largest decrease in revenue was in North Sea taxes, which reflects falling oil and gas prices during the year. Now, of course, that was before the war in Iran, so I would imagine that will change come the next Gers document. But it does kind of dovetail in nicely, doesn't it, John, with suggestions that the UK government might be changing their position or softening their position on new North Sea oil, not quite drill baby drill, but maybe supporting existing projects that are in the pipeline.
Yeah, the mood music does very much feel like the UK government are going to turn on this, and that the Jackdaw and Rosebank developments are going to get the green light. It's a sort of technical thing about these aren't new developments. These are ones that were already in the pipeline. So within the government's own sort of net zero commitments, they could go ahead with these. I do just get the feeling that under current circumstances, I mean, it really is a bit pie in the sky to just say, on an environmental argument, we're just not going to have any new oil and gas developments, when the reality of our economy is that we are still getting 70% of our energy from oil and gas. Pretty much the fundamental component of any economy is cheap access to energy. This is why the war in Ukraine and now the closure of the Straits of Hormuz are having a horrific impact on economies all around the world. Scotland has got this really quite incredible oil and gas resource in the North Sea. Now, it's true that that's anything produced from that goes into an international market and doesn't necessarily come directly to Scotland, but nonetheless, clearly this natural asset gives us energy security if we needed it, and the potential at least to have some of our own supply of oil and gas, allowing us to have some control over domestic prices. So it just to have ad hoc, and I think really Labour and the SNP kind of look like they're shifting thinking on this. I think rather than having ad hoc policy that we just oppose any new developments, what you really need to do is look at how much oil and gas are we still using. Yes, let's go for net zero in terms of stopping using so much oil and gas, but until that happens, while we're still using it, you've got to support the oil and gas industry and all of the jobs and tax revenues that come from that. I mean, the fundamental argument for decades for Scottish independence was based on the fact that we're a petro economy like Norway, which could be very wealthy. It's very difficult to make that argument if you're going to say that your policy is to shut down the oil and gas industry. It's going to be interesting how the SNP deal with this. John Swinney has criticised in the last week the UK government for not supporting the oil and gas industry enough. And I think the big question is, well, fine, so are you saying that you are supportive of the UK government granting these new licences? I don't really see how John Swinney can argue both sides of that somehow the UK government's not been supportive enough while opposing new drilling.
Well, in that case, see, Andy Burnham can change his policy and he can approve Jackdaw and he can approve Rosebank, which were, of course, already approved by the previous Tory government and then held up and what have you. But the fact is he's got a huge majority. John Swinney doesn't have a majority, and the only party that's going to help him get any legislation passed, including his budget, is the Scottish Greens. So John Swinney's in a much, much more difficult position over this than Andy Burnham is, because Swinney relies on that pair that you can see on screen to prop up his minority SNP administration. So, yeah, I think John Swinney, if this is an appropriate phrase, is over a barrel on this one, and I don't see how he gets out of it.
Same question to both of you. Now, put aside the economic arguments for more drilling and the jobs arguments, which are absolutely critical. I accept that. Just look at it from a political perspective. The SNP are kind of softening the Sturgeon position. It's clear Burnham wants to shift. We've had Joe Fagan and Michael Mara in the Scottish Labour leadership contest saying they back, I think, those projects. Isn't it the case that if all those parties move on to that position, it's going to leave the Greens standing alone talking about climate change and the dangers posed by fossil fuels?
I think that's true to an extent, but the reality is that if we're going to be importing oil and gas because we still use it while trying to look good by saying we're not going to exploit our own oil and gas resources, there is a very strong argument that that's actually more carbon intensive because you're importing oil and gas from the other side of the world. So I think that you can make a coherent argument for fully accepting the environmental challenges, but making the point that you need to have, a sensible strategy to deal with that. I think that I think Labour and the SNP can win that argument.
And doesn't it benefit the Greens, though, if all the other parties are essentially drilling in the same sea?
Well, it might do. I mean, the Greens have obviously done quite well at Holyrood. They appear to have done well at UK level. But, I would hope that there is a ceiling on the number of voters who would lend their votes to the Greens, given that, I mean, they're not really a pro. I mean, this might actually force them to go back to being more of an environmental party, because at the moment they're more just like a kind of hard left Marxist bunch of student politicians. So I think there's a limit on the number of votes the Greens can get.
I mentioned the two Labour leadership contenders, Mara and Fagan. So I think officially we're not still in a contest. I think that comes when nominations close next week. So right now we've got three contenders. We've got Mara, Fagan and Monica Lennon. Monica Lennon, obviously, John, is struggling to make the ballot due to a lack of support amongst parliamentarians. What struck me so far is just the lack of an ideological debate or a debate on the chewy issues like the relationship with the UK party. Instead, it seems to have been camps throwing mud at each other, quite personal stuff rather than policy or anything more lofty than that.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to have degenerated quite quickly into quite a nasty campaign. There's not really been much in terms of big ideas about politics and the direction of politics. But interestingly, one of the few kind of significant things that all of the candidates have been very keen to emphasise is that they believe in sort of returning or giving power to Labour members and giving them a lot more say in the way the parties run, etc. That's so slightly ironic that the situation at the moment with the leadership campaign is that you could possibly have a situation where members won't even get to decide the leader because through the mathematics of having to get the support of MPs, MSPs, trade unions, affiliated organisations, there could be this crazy situation where Monica Lennon possibly can't get the support of enough MPs and MSPs, despite it would appear having a lot of support from trade unions, etc. Michael Mara might have the support of loads of MSPs and MPs, but not enough support among the unions. It could end up with a situation where there could be a coronation of Joe Fagan, a guy who's only been an MSP for a matter of weeks because of this strange mathematics for the other candidates, which would mean that members wouldn't even get a chance to vote on who they want to be the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland.
Ben, I mean, the Scottish Labour leadership contest would have been a big thing 15 years ago. Is it still a big thing?
No, I don't think it is. I think you're right. I think it does seem. I don't think there's any great discussions of where. I've not heard any of the three contenders come up with a plan for how they turn Scottish Labour around from their current sort of position in the doldrums, which is surely the one thing that should be electrifying this contest. I think, as we've said before, they're probably hoping that Andy Burnham does a good job and that'll help them, whoever wins, return to some sort of wider popularity in Scotland. I think I would say Michael Mara to me seems like the best choice, but that's maybe because he's closest to my politics. If he's more of the sort of centre-left, centre ground of Scottish Labour. I don't know. I mean, I saw Michael Shanks, the Rutherglen MP, was asked about this on the radio today, and he said it's a contest we didn't need, and I think he's spot on there. I do think Anna Sarwar's kind of put them in a difficult spot here by jumping ship for the Lord.
No one wanted a leadership contest at this time. It's get the review out the way, steady the ship for a bit, and then later on this year, do it. But I think all the people involved in this seem to feel quite harassed that they weren't expecting it, that it's been done on an Sarwar's timetable. So, I mean, I think there's sort of unanimity in the Scottish Labour Party on all sides that Anna Sarwar, John, hasn't done any favours with this particular decision and the timing of it.
No, I think there's a general feeling that that Anas stuck around as leader after the disastrous election just long enough to get offered another job, and then you couldn't see him for dust as soon as he was offered a position in the House of Lords in a ministerial role in Andy Burnham's government in London. I mean, they are where we are. Maybe it's better that you just get this whole thing sorted as soon as possible. I'm not really convinced that this whole review into what went wrong's a great idea. I think the fact is that they lost. They're now one of, 3 parties that are trailing the SNP at Holyrood. The important things to get a leader in place. The reality is they're going to be in opposition for many years now. They need to get a leader in place that's a good campaigner, that can make the case for Labour. They need to hope things go well for Andy Burnham, and there's every chance that by the time another Holyrood election comes around, they could be looking at forming a government, maybe as a coalition, perhaps being able to put a First Minister in. I think they just need to get on with it now.
Just finally, Nicola Sturgeon back in the media this week. I was going to say her fight back continues. So very recently she slagged off her successor John Swinney's election strategy, despite the fact that he was nothing but loyal to her. She's also been taking shots at Joanna Cherry and I think J.K. Rowling. John, if you were advising her, okay, before I come to that question, how should a politician or a former leader behave once they've left office, do you think?
I think history would tell you that former leaders can't help themselves sticking their oar in, and so they all think that if only they were still in position, then everything would be a lot better, and they just can't help but offer a bit of advice to whoever came after them. I think that Nicola Sturgeon's in a quite unique position, given what's happened since she left, that she would be very much advised just to stay out of it entirely, if only just because the people who she left in the SNP have been incredibly supportive of her, given the circumstances of Peter Murrell's arrest and imprisonment, etc. So I think that she should just keep out of it as much as possible, if only to show a bit of, to return some of the loyalty that John Swinney has given her. It does feel now that, this has been coming for a while, that the bridges are now being burned from both sides, and the patience even among the upper echelons of the SNP is kind of ran out with Nicola Sturgeon now.
Joe, Ben, not that she would ever hire you as an advisor, but if she did ask for advice, what would you say to her?
Well, my message to Nicola Sturgeon is please, please, please keep going. This is absolute manna from heaven for the Express. We're loving every minute of it. The Joanna Cherry, J.K. Rowling spats, the complete rewriting of history. It's absolute gold. So we're loving it. So please carry on, Nicola, and don't ever retire gracefully and take yourself off the public stage.
I think Ben's hitting on something that's quite a pertinent point here, that actually, if you were advising, the difficulty for the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon now is that any publicity is kind of good for Nicola Sturgeon. She's clearly wants to pursue a new career as a writer. She wants as much publicity as possible, and I don't think it really matters if that publicity is bad. For the SNP, it means that they are subjected to a kind of eternal barrage of criticism, potentially. So what's good for one is not good for the other anymore.
Well, on a serious point, I do wonder if this is yet another example of why the SNP's refusal to take seats in the House of Lords just actually damages the party, because Nicola Sturgeon could have gone off to become, Baroness Sturgeon of Irvine. She'd be getting 300 quid a day. She'd be able to take part in various debates about various issues that she's interested in, but it would have kept her inside the tent. And really, as a member of the House of Lords, she can't really then be seen to be criticising current First Ministers. So I've always thought the SNP, they're kind of cutting off their nose to spite their face, because they've got nowhere to put their retired MPs and MSPs, which is essentially what the Lords is for.
All right, that's great. pretty much finishes this episode. Thanks to John and to Ben for joining me, and thanks also to Paul from the Record Video team who produced this episode. You can listen to Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch it on the Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.